Terrific. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on this matter of public importance submitted by Senator Bernardi, which relates to the 3rd of February of 2018, marking the 9-year anniversary of the former Rudd government's $42 billion stimulus package, the urgent need to address the resultant debt and deficit. I'd like to address this in a few ways. I've had members opposite talk about the investment by the Rudd government and how successful it was and how it achieved the objectives and it wasn't to blame for today. And I'd like to go back, though, to a statement that then Prime Minister Gillard made, and this is in July of 2010, July 16, 2010. And I'll quote from the article in The Australian. It says, Julia Gillard has conceded that the delivery of her school building program was flawed, but she has assured voters she has learned from her mistakes. After months of defending the $16.2 billion Building the Education Revolution scheme that she oversaw when she was Education Minister, the Prime Minister said yesterday that errors had been made because the program had been designed in haste to protect jobs during the global financial crisis. She then goes on to say, looking back, of course, we realise now that there are lessons to have been learned, and Ms Gillard said it was clear to her that it was necessary to apply commercial expertise to the rollout of major building projects. End quote. Well, no surprise there. If you are spending billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, you would have thought that the starting point would have been to apply some commercial nous to that, for the simple reason that it impacts on the efficacy of the program, but also it impacts on the unintended consequences of that program. One of those unintended consequences, having spoken to a number of people at the time who were seeking to get tradesmen or other things, was that when there was so much focus in specific areas of industry, supply and demand means that availability and price for everyone else went downhill. It was hard to get someone at a reasonable price because of all this work that was being rushed out. But to the main point of this topic from Senator Bernardi, so I was just using that to highlight that what members opposite saying wasn't supported by Ms Gillard, who admitted herself that it wasn't the success that those opposite have been saying. In fact, lessons were learned. It was a failure that she promised never to do again in the context of that election. What we have seen, though, is that funding that has been locked in, and governments of all persuasions have put funding commitments, recurrent funding commitments in, or spending commitments into legislation, but what we saw was an incredible increase during the period of the Rudd, Gillard and Rudd governments, which meant that Australia's gross debt was increasing at an average rate of 33.9% a year. And if that rate of increase had been allowed to continue unchecked, our debt would now be over $1 trillion. Now, I hear the Greens say that debt is not a bad word, and I agree. Debt doesn't have to be a dirty word, but it has to be sensible debt, well managed. And if you put it in the context that people in most homes and small businesses around Australia would understand, you can use debt and a mortgage on a house or an essential asset like a car, for example, may be something that is justifiable. But if you spend money on your day-to-day living expenses, you end up borrowing money on your credit card to pay for your mortgage and pay for your living expenses because you have been living above your means, most households and pretty much every small business would tell you that that is a path to ruin, which is why you need to get the spending back under control. And that's the thing that the coalition government, since election in 2013, has been very focused on doing. And so the growth in our gross debt has been cut by 2/3. And so by the 2017-18 MyEFO, it's been brought back to 9%. So again, the things that the Greens were talking about, saying because the credit ratings say that Australia is not a risk, it's not because we had huge debt, it's because we have taken steps to manage the growth in our debt. Those opposite would also have you believe that all of these spending measures have been locked in by the coalition. They are anticipating the fact that the Australian public has a short memory. Go back, following the election in 2013, to both Treasurer Hockey and Treasurer Morrison, and the number of times they sought to bring legislation before the Senate to introduce savings measures to reduce the extent of government spending, which was increasing our debt and leading to that situation where we were borrowing money to pay the interest on our existing debt. And it was blocked predominantly by the Labor Party, by the Greens and occasionally by the Xenophon Party. And so for them to then turn around and say that it's the coalition's government fault that debt has continued to rise, they are the ones who locked in many of the measures. They are the ones who blocked our attempts to actually cut that back. But despite their best efforts, we have worked constructively with the crossbench to still be able to put in to place measures to reduce that growth in expenditure by 2/3, such that we are back on a track to look to having net debt peaking in 18-19 at 19.2% of GDP. Now that's about $11.9 billion lower than the peak that was estimated at the budget. And it shows that the measures taken by this government mean that we are on track to try and achieve a surplus and to get debt under control. Now, one of the other things about debt, as Senator Whish-Wilson said, debt doesn't have to be a dirty word, but it has to be spent on something that is useful. And much of the feedback I had during the Building the Education Revolution was that while the concept of school infrastructure is good, the focus on the school halls meant that quite often people ended up with halls that they didn't really need nor necessarily want, and at a cost that was far higher than they would have wished to have paid, and they could have done something better with the money. We've also had criticism from the Greens about the way this government is investing money. Now, we've just had the release of the Foreign Policy White Paper. Last year or the year before, we had the Defence White Paper. We've seen recent developments around the globe showing that we live in an increasingly uncertain environment where great powers are seeking influence, where non-state actors such as terror groups seek to disrupt not only our way of life but particularly our economic means of production. Given that Australia is an export nation, most of our exports by volume and to a certain extent value go by sea. Our import of critical items such as fuel oils come by sea, and so safe sea lanes of communication are absolutely important, which is why this government, for the first time, has had a defence industry policy statement and plan that recognises that defence industry is actually a fundamental input to our sovereign capability as a nation to defend ourselves, and that the approach that's been taken in the past, which has seen peaks and troughs in the workload, which has meant that companies are started up normally with high risk and cost and then wind down or fail due to a lack of work, this government for the first time has put in place plans that will see those peaks and troughs of work levelled out so that we have workflows and jobs that will last for generations, delivering the capability that Australia needs to defend both our national interests, which includes obviously our economic interests. Even the defence export policy, which was criticised by the Greens, if you go back to the 2015 report of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, a bipartisan report highlighting principles that led to the defence industry policy statement, it recommended that Australia move proactively to boost exports in those areas where defence had identified that defence industry was a sovereign input to our capability. And that's exactly what the Defence Export Plan does. So this is not about wasting money like Building the Education Revolution. This is about a strategic investment in those defence industry sectors that are required to maintain Australia's sovereign ability to protect our national interests home and abroad.